Well, welcome everyone to this webinar on the German elections and the future of the economy. I'm Peter Rashish, Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics Program at AGI. Germany went to the polls on February 23rd, and negotiations are already getting underway toward the formation of a new government, likely to be led by the Christian Democrats under Friedrich Merz, with the Social Democrats as their coalition partner. In addition to a long list of domestic and security policy challenges, which are quite prominent, have been prominent, are quite prominent, whether it's immigration or the dramatically shifting dynamics we're seeing in Ukraine, it's also true that the new chancellor will need to find, that he will find several economic policy questions right at the top of his inbox. Some of these, I think, are likely to be how Germany can reform its economic model faced with competition mainly from China, but also what we're seeing already starting today, let's say in the US, with much more coercive trade policies, also how to incentivize domestic investment, and in addition to all that, ways that Germany can spearhead new approaches at the EU level to areas like finance, energy, and trade, which will, in turn, and in fact, may be necessary to promoting German prosperity and economic security. So we have a lot to discuss. We have an excellent panel. We will start today's event with a conversation with the panelists, and then I'll open things up to all of you who are viewing the event for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab on your screen. Before we jump in, let me just briefly introduce our four panelists. Fran Burwell is a Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and a Managing Director at McClarty Associates. Her work focuses on the EU and US-EU relations, as well as transatlantic political and defense issues, and her most recent report is Digital Sovereignty in Practice, the EU's Push to Shape the New Global Economy. Sebastian Dulin is research director at the Macroeconomic Policy Institute of the Hans Böckle Foundation in Düsseldorf, as well as a professor for international economics at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, and a non-resident fellow with us here at AGI. His research focuses on European integration, international macroeconomics, and financial market regulation. Alex Privitera is also a non-resident senior fellow at AGI, a columnist at Brink News, and a professor at Marconi University in Rome. He focuses primarily on Germany's European policies and their impact on relations between the United States and Europe. And he is also the author of the very recently published book, Achtung, Why the German Model is Malfunctioning, What to Do About It. Sander Tordouar is chief economist at the Center for European Reform in London. He works on Eurozone monetary and fiscal policy, the institutional architecture of European monetary union, European integration, as well as Germany's role in the EU. Before joining CER, he worked as an advisor to the European Central Bank representative at the International Monetary Fund, covering the IMF's surveillance of euro area policies and sovereign debt issues. So let me start with you, Sebastian. We are already seeing discussions about finding new funds for domestic spending in Germany since the election. So a little more broadly, how much success do you think not only the next German government will have in boosting domestic investment, whether it's for innovation, technology, or infrastructure, but longer term, do you think that we're going to start to see a consensus that Germany needs a more activist government approach to economic policy than we've seen in the past?
I think these days, or let's say the next 3 weeks, are really crucial about what we're going to see, and for one simple reason, that the fiscal space this government is going to have is determined in the next 3 weeks, and that is, I'm not sure how many of you have followed the coverage of the German. Well, it's not coalition negotiations, but we have something, these are pre-negotiations. Before we go into coalition negotiations, usually there are so-called Sondierungsgespräche, where the parties come together and they discuss broad strokes. What makes them special at the moment is that there is a proposal on the table that just before the new Bundestag will constitute itself and come together for the first time, the old Bundestag might change the constitution very quickly. And what is on the table there is to create 2 extra special purpose vehicles or extra budgets. And one of them is allowed to borrow 400 billion additionally to what the debt brake is saying, and the other is allowed to borrow 400 to 500 billion additionally. I mean, this is a proposal now; it's not decided yet, but that would give quite a bit of fiscal space for the next years. We would come up with 900 billion then. 900 billion is a bit more than 20% of German GDP. So that would be enough to increase defense spending, put money into infrastructure investment. And some of that infrastructure investment would also probably be in a way of industrial policy. However, we don't know if that is going down well, and we don't even know whether the parties, this is a proposal by 4 economists. It has been brokered together by Jakob von Weizsäcker, who used to be a senior official in the finance ministry when Scholz was there. He is now finance minister of the tiny state of Saarland. He's an economist. Some people might know him from Bruegel. He wrote the proposal on red bonds, blue bonds in the past. And but this is a proposal which is now seriously discussed. And I mean, especially Friedrich Merz has the challenge that, I mean, if he would pass that, he basically could do whatever he wants. He could pass his tax cuts. Because you could shift some of the things, some of the on-budget spending into these off-budget entities, so that would really give them fiscal space. But of course, he has promised not to touch the debt brake. Now you can say this is not touching the debt brake, or well, he hasn't so much as promised, but he has said that that is the last thing he would do it, but only after they have discussed everything else. And now they are doing this. Not after they have done everything else, but before they do anything else. And so this is, well, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. The second problem is we don't know how the Greens are going to react to that, because you now need a 2/3 majority in the outgoing Bundestag. And the point is, the coalition plus the Greens don't have a 2/3 majority in the incoming Bundestag, so they really have to do it in the next 3 weeks. And it's possible. We have passed large legislation within a day. I mean, you can cut second and third reading of a bill, and you can do that. But in a way, some people say this is not quite honest, yeah, because before that he was campaigning against new debt, and now he's suddenly with a stroke of a pen, basically allowing him another 900 billion in debt. So, but I know in the US you have midnight appointments by outgoing presidents, and so maybe we can have a midnight constitutional change. Yeah, but maybe I stop here and don't go on too long, but we can discuss the details of that in a moment.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. Turning to you, Alex, the report from former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi on competitiveness outlines a number of steps where both greater investment and sort of deepening aspects of the single market would boost European prosperity. I mean, we just heard Sebastian talk about the domestic level. What do you think about Germany at the EU level exerting more leadership than we've seen over the last few years and really pushing for this kind of agenda that Draghi sets out?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me, first of all. Then I'd like to continue where Sebastian left it off, because I also think that even at the European level, whether there will be more ambition around the Draghi report, or at least some aspects of the Draghi reports in the coming years, or the coming months, let's call it like this, because things are moving very fast. It largely depends on how bold Merz and the SPD, in this case, are going to be in the next few weeks. And of course, it hinges on the Greens as well, but I think primarily on those two pushing for a real decision and a bold decision in the coming few weeks. My reading of the situation is that at the moment they're trying to focus primarily, at least the CDU is primarily on the defense fund, which is a little bit more limited in scope. But Merz has basically demonstrated in the past few weeks that he can make bold decisions and move relatively quickly. If you think about his stance towards the US, many people have pointed out he was the chairman or the president of the Atlantic Brücke for about 10 years. He's a true transatlanticist, and basically with a stroke of a pen or with a few sentences, he has, I wouldn't say ditched the German-US relationship, but basically completely reshaped it, because he thinks that perhaps in a few months from now, we won't even have a NATO that deserves the name of the old alliance. So he can move things. He can move. He has basically become much closer to Macron's line on the transatlantic relationship. And now the question is whether he will embrace a little bit of Macronism even at the European level. And so far, it's unclear. It's unclear because the Draghi report, at least from on the CDU side, has been linked a little bit too heavily, at least initially, with this request of tabling about 800 billion euros in terms of investment needs, and the possibility of issuing new common debt at the European level, which is still not very well received by Merz, but primarily by his own party. Let's not forget that, of course, the moment that Merz starts touching the very thorny issue of debt issuance, German debt issuance, but even more so European debt issuance, he will have the AfD on his heels immediately. And here the question is, will he ignore that and work with a timeline of 4 years trying to remake what needs to be remade, or will he be a force which is always looking behind his back to see whether the AfD is inching closer to him, ready to bite? And that's unclear at the moment. And in terms of the Draghi report, I think there are two issues with the Draghi report which are difficult for the Germans to accept. But I'd like to hear from the others, what they think about that. One is of course, let's put the sort of debt issuance aside. One is, of course, reinventing basically the European business model. It's not just the German business model. The European business model is basically the German business model. It's export driven, and it's, of course, depends largely on old manufacturing, which can be upgraded and updated, but is basically old manufacturing, which, incidentally, is the same fixation that Donald Trump seems to have. So old technology and reboosting and revamping old technology, rather than considering, or sort of factoring in how much the economies have changed in the meantime. So that's one aspect. So does Germany, or does Merz Germany, want to revamp its export-driven, manufacturing-driven, sort of Export-Weltmeister economic model of old, or will he really embrace a new kind of economic mix based on newer technologies, and also based primarily on the European market rather than the global markets, because we see that global markets are fracturing, or at least are under duress, and only relying on extra European exports will probably not do the trick. So that's the question, and number one. And the second question is whether he will embrace a dismantling of the remaining barriers between the European economies themselves. Draghi has pointed it out many times that there are so many barriers between the EU member states that obsessing about sort of extra EU tariffs, Trump tariffs in this case, is perhaps beside the point, because there's so many barriers between European economies that if those were dismantled, that would give the European economy a boost, even in a slightly more sort of hostile global environment. And then the question really is, does it mean accepting European champions? Does it mean, for instance, making progress on banking union and accepting the formation of European banking champions? In this case, of course, one possible merger comes to mind, and that's UniCredit and Commerzbank. Yes or no? And the question is I don't feel I can give a definite answer on that. But I think it's just least should be our focus to see whether there's movement on those fronts, and that would give us a pretty good idea of on which way this new government, or at least Merz as the leader of the new government, will go.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. Sander, Alex mentioned a bit the global versus European economy. And one big part, of course, of the global economy outside of the EU is China. I know that you have written a bit about the idea of a second China shock, and there's been some discussion of that, and that this time the China shock wouldn't be affecting the US, but primarily Germany and its traditional industries, autos, chemicals, machine building, others. What do you think, if anything, the next German government will do faced with this challenge from China, and maybe talk a little bit about this contrast between what you might call, or at least what I would tempted to call, perfectionism versus real innovation when you're talking about which sectors the economy should focus on in the future.
Thanks, Peter, and sorry for being a minute late. I was embroiled in another debate about European defense bonds that I think both Sebastian and Alex brought up already. So
we may get to that later.
There's a lot going on. In a way, I think I can kind of nicely pick up on their two interventions. So I'll start with China, but I'll end with the following observation: that in some ways, 800 billion or 600 billion or 900 billion in additional German spending is both also a response to the China shock and also represents a fundamental change in the German growth model along the lines of the way that Alex described his first bucket of issues, less so the question of whether we complete the European market. So what's happening? The first China shock in the late 90s and 2000s, when China joined the World Trade Organization, was a time in which Chinese exports exploded, but they tended to be in sectors that Germany wasn't in. So think of textiles, furniture, consumer electronics. And in fact, of all the economies in the West, it was probably Germany that benefited from the first China shock, that benefited from China industrializing, because China has always been skeptical of imports. It's always had a very one-sided view on trade, mainly exports, very few imports if they can avoid it. And Germany was the exception, because they built the machines that they needed for the factories, and they built the cars that the Chinese elite like to buy. Now that has fundamentally changed in the last 4 years in particular. Two key factors. One is China has long had the ambition to emulate and then replicate the entire German economy. That has been a core focus of Chinese industrial policy for a decade. Made in China 2025. You mentioned the core sectors: machine building, cars. Don't forget planes. Europe's probably most productive sector, or one of the most. They even have a program called the 10,000 Little Giants, which specifically wants to replicate the entire German Mittelstand, all the medium-sized, very innovative, cutting-edge German industrial firms. That's one. Plowed a lot of money into it, and it worked. It kind of worked. In many of these areas, China is now close to or on the frontier. But then, in that period, basically, China was blowing up a huge real estate bubble. It's always had low consumption. It's had a very large mountain of savings that for a while was plowed into real estate. Since the real estate bubble burst via the communist bank, basically communist-run banking system, is now being put into expanding manufacturing capacity in these core sectors. And so the net result has been a violent return to export-led growth. Chinese exports are growing at 14 to 15% annually, global trade at 3%. German exports are flat or declining. Eurozone exports are flat or declining. Essentially, cars, machines, all the things Europe's good at, we're getting pushed out of the Chinese market, and we're getting pushed out of third markets and increasingly facing competition within the European market. And so, I think this is a major part of Germany's economic stagnation of the last 4 years. I think the two major contributions to Germany's 5 to 6% GDP shortfall versus pre-pandemic growth path is energy, obviously, and the China shock. So if you just look at cars, these are quite stunning numbers that Brad Setzer and I showed in the paper. Germany's net car exports have declined by 50% in 4 years. China's net car exports were 0 4 years ago. They were not a net car exporter. Now they export 5 million vehicles net a year. Imports have not gone up. Again, China does not do imports. China does exports. And exports have six-folded. And essentially, China has capacity to export limitless cars more because they've built so many car factories. So this is an existential threat for the Germans. The question is, how do they respond? I don't know. Scholz was of the view that the EV tariffs were a bad idea and tried to block it at the European level. It only passed because France, Italy, and German actually free trade allies like Ireland, Denmark, and the Netherlands saw that China does not believe in a level playing field and out of principle pushed the tariffs through. I hope that Matt takes a more realistic view on what China represents, but I'm not sure. What is clear is that one of the key things that Germany needs to do, and Alex was saying this, is that if you don't have demand from China, and if tariffs are coming from the US, which was the big offsetting market for German exports, let's not forget the US overtook China as Germany's most important trading partner 12 months ago. Then the only sizable source of demand left is the European market. And the sizable source of fiscal space in Europe is Germany itself. And so if you start putting hundreds of billions into infrastructure, industrial policy, and military spending, I think that will be very important for the German economy. And I have some faith, I'm quite bullish, in fact, that kind of fiscal change will actually get the German growth engine going again. I do, on your point of old versus new sectors, I believe that it's a false contradiction. So I think it is an illusion to believe that we can reallocate away from Germany's or Europe's core manufacturing sectors to imaginary big tech sectors. Tech is employment poor. Even US big tech does not employ a lot of people. It creates a hell of a lot of profit, but it does not employ a lot of people. I essentially think Europe needs to do both. You need to have industrial policy to protect your core manufacturing base against China, and you need to build the longer-term foundations for more high-end software and engineering, capital markets union, complete the single market so innovative firms can scale. We know what needs to be done, and now it's the question, Alex, the second point, will it be done is an open question. And I think Draghi's FT title was great. It was, Europe shouldn't worry about US tariffs. It should worry about the tariffs it has imposed upon itself. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you, Sander. Let's now turn to you, Fran. We've covered a lot of ground inside Germany, the EU, China. So thinking about the United States, it was only 10 days ago or so that the likely next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, in reaction to especially what's going on in the security realm, but maybe other areas too, said that Europe needs independence from the US. Do you see this idea also having ramifications for the transatlantic economic relationship? And if so, how realistic do you think the notion is of the EU, I could be tempted to say, finally having greater strategic autonomy in this area?
So let me say first that we don't know quite yet whether Friedrich Merz's statement was a heat of the moment type of thing or a considered reanalysis of his longstanding transatlantic position. But I suspect that the events of the last couple of weeks have pushed it into the latter camp, have reinforced the idea of independence. And let me break it down into kind of political, economic, and security. The political, I think, just to be brief, a crucial point was reached last week at the United Nations when the United States did not sign on to a General Assembly resolution, which pointed to Russia as the aggressor in the Ukraine war. And this had initially actually been a US resolution that was very vague about that, and that the Europeans with others amended. And then we abandoned the resolution. We ended up being in the same camp as Belarus and North Korea and Russia, as well as others. And I think the Europeans that I have spoken to were frankly shocked and surprised by this development. But I think that it shows politically how far apart the Atlantic has widened in the last month. On the economics, I think when you talk about independence economically, it's good to remember that this is the largest economic relationship in the world between the United States and the EU, despite all our current back and forth. And it has been growing in value, not shrinking in value. 2023 saw a record goods trade of 1.2 trillion. President Trump is right that there is a significant deficit for the United States in goods trade, but there is a services surplus for the United States that makes up about half of that. But we've also seen US companies doing extremely well in Europe. 2023, we saw the highest sales by the European branches of US companies, $3.8 trillion, so much more than the goods trade is worth. We're seeing the pattern of this economic relationship is not goods being traded across the Atlantic. It is investment and direct participation in each other's economies. And that's a little bit unusual in the global marketplace, but particularly, I would say among the industrial economies, it has been something growing. Given that, it's unclear how impactful tariffs will be. I agree with Sanders' observations and Mario Draghi's observations on that. But I think politically, as well as on particular companies, they have a big impact. I think what is having an even bigger impact right now is uncertainty. And when I talk to business leaders, it is the uncertainty about whether tariffs will be just a threat or be a reality. Also, the shift in regulatory policies in the United States. These are all things that raise questions about whether a company should trade with the United States or invest in the United States. And where do you cross the line? Is Donald Trump right in thinking that tariffs will push companies to decide to invest in the United States? It's too early to tell whether that is going to be the case or not. There are some significant obstacles. I mentioned the uncertainty, but also there are obstacles in terms of whether you can get the right workforce. So I think that there are challenges. It's not simply a matter of companies moving from Europe and coming to the United States. And I agree with those who are seeing even more investment or economic development between the US and Europe, each focused on its own market. So a nationalization of economies, if I can put it that way, without meaning government ownership or anything, just that everyone's policy is aiming towards higher barriers, and we are more likely to see production in a market for that market. Now, there's a big question for Europe, which has at the same time been doing trade deals with everyone else around the world, most recently with Mercosur, but also updating its Mexican agreement. And of course, there are also other potential partners, Japan, Korea, both of whom have free trade agreements with the EU, I believe. And the question is whether Europe will refocus its economy on its own, or whether these trade deals will make it more of a hub of what remains of the liberalized trading system. And it's far too early to tell. And as Sander has made clear, Europe will also have to deal with the general retrenchment of the Chinese market, both because of government policy and the poor economy. I think the crucial date I'm watching is March 12th. This morning at midnight, the new tariffs on China and on Mexico and Canada went into effect. March 12th is the date for Europe, because that is the date when we will see whether the steel and aluminum tariffs are put back on, removing the Biden administration arrangement that was reached between the United States and Europe. Europe had already suspended its retaliation until March 31st. So the question is, if the US goes forward, which, based on actions of the last 24 hours, I'm more convinced we will go forward. Will Europe then retaliate? And I don't know whether Europe will move before March 31st, but if it doesn't do anything, the suspension ends on March 31st and European retaliatory tariffs go into effect. I'm not sure that those tariffs will be economically consequential in themselves, but they set a pattern. And what we are facing over the next year, we will see, as of April 1st, a whole raft of reports come out about where the United States has been treated unfairly, and who has been discriminating. And we will probably see a bunch of investigations launched by the US Trade Rep, the Commerce Department, and others. And so there will continue to be this march of, will there be tariffs? What will the tariffs be on, et cetera. Digital service taxes, such as there are in France, will become a real target. And one of the questions the EU will face is whether the US targets a particular member state, and will the EU respond as a union, potentially using the anti-coercion instrument. There is also the possibility that Trump will offer deals to individual member states, and they will have to respond, as they did in Trump 1, that it is the EU that deals with trade policy, not the individual member states. But given the high pressure, much higher pressure that I think everyone is under right now, it may be more challenging for Europe to be united, or it may be that US actions make Europe more united. We just don't know yet which way it's going to go. Let me just say, finally, on strategic issues and strategic autonomy, I think, we have had over the last 24 hours the announcement of a pause in US support for assistance to Ukraine. And there are rumors now that some of the US sanctions on Russia may be relaxed. There is also the potential, although Europe has managed to get 16 packages of sanctions through, which, if you had asked me in 2022 whether that would be possible, I would have said no, but here we are. And yet we probably will face a continuing block by Hungary, perhaps emboldened by the US attitude. And so I think that it's time for Europe to develop a backstop that has to do with the national cooperation outside of the treaties to maintain sanctions. I think the German election, to circle back to where we began, the German election is going to be crucial in how Europe responds to these challenges. And I'm not sure at this point. I mean, remember, we are 6 weeks into the Trump administration, and already there are fundamental changes in the way the US deals with its allies. And so I'm not sure when Merz brings up the issue of independence, whether there is any choice for Europe. And the question for me is whether Germany will be ready, and will it still be engaged in coalition negotiations for the next month, potentially 2 months, while the US is moving quickly in a different direction. And so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Fred. Let me pick up on that, and also something that Sander mentioned, and that is this issue of defense spending, and because just today we had a speech from Commission President von der Leyen, which maybe with a little exaggeration, sounds to me like something that a president of the United States of Europe would be saying. She's talking about the highest form of sovereignty there is, jealously guarded by the member states traditionally defense, right? And she's calling for 800 billion euros of defense spending, with 150 billion in euro bonds, which up till now have only been used in the context of recovering from COVID. She also mentioned a greater role for the European Investment Bank, and kind of with a nod to the Letta rather than the Draghi report, to private capital markets, and particularly sort of a tighter EU single market. I have two questions to all of you on this. The first is this move by von der Leyen something that Merz is likely to be comfortable with, or even support? And you know, in terms of both Germany's interests and also the kind of relationship that Merz is likely to have with von der Leyen and her commission, Merz and the German government in the future. And how do you think this kind of announcement plays into what Merz said about independence and into the transatlantic relationship? Is this a force for stability in that relationship? Is it going to be neutral? What do any of you think on that, about that? Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, first, of course, it depends on, Fran asked the question, was that a one-off by Friedrich Merz because he's, well, he can be very emotional, or is this really a deeper shift in his thinking? If it's the second, I think he will embrace it for a number of reasons, because we haven't talked about that yet, but Germany doesn't just have the debt brake, but it also is in, well, close to a position where it might be in conflict with European fiscal rules. And if you borrow jointly and spend money jointly, this is not counted to national expenditure. So that would be an easy way out of that. So that really might help him here. And if he really wants to, I mean, this is a moment now he can seize and secure a place in history. I mean, if he's now a chancellor and he tries to get, well, to just somehow squeeze the budget into the debt brake, cut a little bit of marginal taxes, there will be no role for him in history. If he now steps up and is the European leader who really leads into European independence from the United States, well, maybe he can use some of the 900 billion of German fiscal space to do that. He might, well, he certainly will go down in history for better or worse. We will judge later on whether that has worked out or not. But it really, I mean, I think it might be a defining moment of his chancellorship, and just at the beginning now. And so I think he will embrace it. And even though, I mean, this is another part of the irony. I think the Christian Democrats in the past have said NGG is Next Gen EU is a one-off and it will not be repeated. Yeah. So and here we are 5 years later, and maybe it will be repeated again. So it's but nevertheless, I mean, once you have started shifting or giving up your positions, well, why not also that one? I mean, if he does, and it's really, I think this really is still open, and we don't know how these coalition negotiations go about. I mean, if you talk to people who are close to Merz, or know him better, they sometimes say it might depend who he talks to over the next 2 weeks. Maybe he doesn't have a position and it's still open. So that makes it so exciting and interesting to observe what's going on now.
Okay, let's go. I'm going to go in the order of how we actually started. So Alex, let me go to you, and then Sander, and then Fran.
Yes, only to say I completely agree with Sebastian. I mean, the way I understand the proposals made by von der Leyen today, 150 billion is, as you say, common new debt, and about 650 billion, give or take. Let's take the sort of EIB role aside, will basically fiscal space that is created by not counting defense spending against the debt rules at the European level. Now that's of course it's a bit skew width on one side, because the 650, if you have fiscal space, it's okay. If you have real fiscal space, if you don't have fiscal space, and it's basically just, let's call it a little accounting trick by the European Union's Commission to say you can spend it even if you don't have it. The question mark is, how will markets react? So far, markets seem to embrace this new role of Europe. And of course, today it's been a sort of general sell-off in general because the tariffs have kicked in. But if you look at at how markets reacted to the first weeks of the Trump administration and the increasing sort of pressure on trade via tariffs, the net beneficiary has been the European Union. So I don't know exactly how the flows. If you break down the flows, what is flowing back to Europe? Is it European investors that bet on the US market and on this perhaps golden age or animal spirits, and are now getting cold feet and pulling back and trying to sort of reinvest in Europe, since Europe has been so cheap for a number of years? Is it US investors as well who are getting increasingly antsy about what's going on in the US and are also sort of reallocating their capital somewhere else? And in this case, Europe seems to be a sort of a good place to invest, given the fact that there will be a de facto stimulus package, at the national, and now we see also at the supranational level. I don't know. I don't know for sure, but it seems to be the case that markets for the moment are buying the story that Europe will rearm, and that Europe's rearmament will have a net beneficial effect on the European economy.
Yeah. Sander.
Yeah, great points. Let me just add 3 observations. The first is picking up on what Fran was discussing. I think there's a kind of tragic moment in the transatlantic relationship, which is that just in the moment that Germany, I think, is starting to understand the kinds of concerns that the Biden administration, but actually consecutive US administrations had with China's overcapacities and the way that China is squeezing manufacturing capacity in the entire G7, etc. Just in that moment, there's a Trump administration that actually wages trade wars against friends and foes alike and doesn't seem to make any distinction. I don't think anybody had tariffs on Mexico and Canada going first on their bingo card 2 months ago, and yet here we are. So, that's not ideal, especially given the very important transatlantic trade relation that Fran described. In an ideal world, you would coordinate the European and American markets against China, but that's not the world that we're in. My second observation is that these things are interlinked to defense. Your basic manufacturing base matters for defense. And so, for example, does clean tech manufacturing. Let me give you 2 examples. What do you need for drones? The most important piece of kit in the Ukraine war. You need batteries. And where are batteries produced? Almost exclusively in China. So, there is an interplay here between the defense question that Europe faces and Germany faces and the clean industrial deal debate that is also raging, and there's a package there. My third observation is that I don't think the Eurobonds that von der Leyen touted are the real deal. So, essentially my understanding of what it is it's a classic back-to-back lending from the EU level. The EU goes to the market, uses the creditworthiness of the bloc as a whole to get a good rate, and then offers loans to member states that have higher borrowing costs. So it is a marginal improvement. It helps certain member states like Poland or Italy that have higher borrowing costs than the EU average, but the net fiscal support is very small. If you look at the recovery fund for the pandemic, the loans compartment, 300 billion in loans, member states get around 6 billion in genuine sort of fiscal support from those. So, putting that together, I think there are still questions here for Merz to answer about how does he want to shape not only a European fiscal policy, but also a European industrial policy, because there is no question to my mind that Germany, as the core of Europe's manufacturing, stands to benefit both from a push to revitalize defense manufacturing, but also to think about sort of the wider future of industry.
Fran?
So I wanted to address the point of what would be the US reaction to more European independence. And I think the reaction of the Trump administration would be great. I think that there are two factors in this. One is the perception, particularly, but not only in conservative circles here, that Europe is a shrinking, dying economy. I do not think that's the case, but that's the perception. US media, when it covers Europe's economy, it covers the German economy, and everyone looks at growth rates. And they have not been awe-inspiring, to put it mildly. So everyone is it's very hard here, unless you are reaching out to European media to get a complete picture of the European economy. And as a result of this poor perception, I think there is not a desire to engage with Europe, and particularly with Germany, as much as we might. Why bother? I mean, this is kind of the attitude in some circles. And so, therefore, I think the rapid implementation of what we're seeing so far with the omnibus regulation last week and other things, the clean industrial deal, even though, most Americans won't pay attention to those as regulatory policy or their details or anything like that. But I do think that the rapid movement on the competitiveness agenda in Europe is extremely important for shifting the perception in certain circles in the United States that Europe is worth dealing with. Europe is worth engaging with. I also think that President Trump, because in a sense, while he doesn't believe in partnerships and alliances, he does believe in deals and negotiations, and he expects the other party to come with their own interests. So this idea that has been really theology in Europe for so long, that before implementing anything, we should take the temperature in Washington and make sure that everything is fine. Trump is not expecting that. He's expecting that Europe will show up with its own interests. He doesn't expect to agree with Europe a lot of the times, just as he doesn't expect to agree with many other partners, at least not on a regular basis. This is a transactional president who is aiming for a deal and then another deal and then another deal. One deal is not going to re-energize a strategic partnership. So I think, when Europeans put forward things that they see as increasing their independence, that's not a bad thing from the point of view of the Trump administration. They want Europe to carry more of the burden. They want Europe to be responsible for Europe.
I see Alex and Sandra. Let me just throw out a couple of, take a couple of questions I've got in the Q&A and sort of roll them into one. And just, I think first part is, and I think you've already addressed this, you probably would say, yes, that these likely changes both at the German level and the defense sector mean that there's going to be more investment in Germany. That's one thing. And then, but then there's a question about what will that mean? What will increase debt at the European level, the trade war, the European growth levels? What will that mean for the value of the euro and interest rates? Or so there's that macro question. But let me turn it over now to Alex. Okay.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll try to answer your last question as well, but just to respond to Fran, I mean, I must say I tend to be a little bit more dark about this administration. I don't think it doesn't care about Europe. It cares about Europe because it thinks that Europe is a ripoff for America. So, you know, I think that what the Trump administration is more likely to do is not to embrace any kind of solution, you know, on the defense front that comes from Europe, but when it comes to all the sort of interactions, overall interactions with the European Union, to try to fragment the European Union. You know, the fact, for instance, that when Keir Starmer was in Washington, you know, I don't know whether it was followed up on or will be followed up on, but basically suggested that perhaps there is a deal to be made, a trade deal to be made between the UK and the US, shows a path to other sort of, let's call them reluctant Europeans. You know, if they want to have a bilateral deal with the Trump and the Trump administration, perhaps it would be wise to peel off from the European Union and then try to do that bilaterally. I think that sort of suggestions will come the European way quite often in the next years. Mm-hmm. If the first few weeks of this Trump administration are any indication of what he intends to do going forward. So, you know, the European member states need to be quite clear-eyed about this and about basically also protecting the European Union's institutions, primarily the EU Commission, which will come increasingly under attack, especially because of DSA and DMA, which, by the way, is also a tool that we have at our disposal. I'm speaking as a European now, that we have at our disposal if the trade friction gets really ugly between the two blocks, because our leverage is much more on that side than it is on the pure goods side, because we don't import very much from the US apart from some energy and other things. And clearly, reducing energy flows from the US will be sort of self-defeating from a European perspective. In terms of what Peter was saying, it pretty much depends on what inflation will do in the US. In Europe. So in the US, we assume that and I'll read this very quickly because I thought it was so illuminating. It's what J.P. Morgan's David Kelly just said. I think in response to the tariffs. The trouble with tariffs, to be succinct, is that they raise prices, slow economic growth, cut profits, increase unemployment, worsen inequality, diminish productivity, and increase global tensions. Other than that, they are fine. So basically, we have a clear indication of how self-defeating, from the US's perspective, all this trade stuff is, and clearly the expectation would be that the rate paths of the euro area and of the Fed could diverge quite significantly in this year. But this is only if the impact of all of this on EU's inflation, on the euro area inflation, will be more muted compared to the one in the US. And I really don't know. I think that the ECB is taking a sort of wait and see approach at this point, so that there will be perhaps one more cut, and then they will sort of look around and see how this plays out. But they won't pre-commit to much more than that in terms of interest rates, which, by the way, is interesting and it is important because interest rates, of course, if we're talking about debt, debt issuance, also for defense spending, it would be very helpful if the interest rates continued to sort of be on a gliding path downward rather than sort of get stuck at some point, especially because some of the member states don't have the fiscal space, and clearly refinancing at higher rates is not very healthy.
We're almost at the hour, so Sander, why don't I let you take us there?
Sure. I don't know if Sebastian still wanted to come in. But
Well, I haven't put my hand up, so well, just go ahead.
Just checking. No, maybe just one last reflection, and because I think Fran made a couple of great points, as did Alex, on this notion of can Europe revitalize itself, and you see now some investor optimism in stock markets in Europe, actually particularly driven by defense stocks, right? So I think, to my mind, it demonstrates that the German economy in particular, but the wider European economy, had been suffering from a lack of directed demand into core manufacturing. And so you see that the moment that the demand is there, you see a real sort of uptick in private finance. So that gives some hope. I think to tie that into the German election, my optimism is fundamentally the following. It holds for Germany, but it holds for Europe at large, is that both industrial production and consumption have been weak, for years now. And in a sense, if you look at Merz, a center-right politician, he wants to do tax cuts, but he has to bring in the industrial policy of the SPD, the climate of the Greens, and just public investment, because that is a widespread. So you may end up with a fiscal package that actually tackles Germany's key economic problems, namely too little consumption. Doing tax cuts can help bring that up, and too little investment. And we've discussed that at length. And so there's some optimism, I think, here that kind of growth engine gets stoked up, and that maybe then friends in the US will look at Europe once again and say, well, maybe these guys aren't all useless. And in fact, I am skeptical that the US, with tariffs and by cutting back all the industrial policy that Biden had been putting out, will be able to rebuild its manufacturing base. And so in a couple of years, the US will have to decide, who do you call for manufactured goods? Do you call China or do you call Brussels? I'm not sure that will change. So that's my optimistic message to friends, the US skeptics on Europe.
Thank you for that. 30 seconds for you, Sebastian, and then for you, Fred.
Just to follow up on what Sander just said, I also think weak demand, aggregate demand in Germany plays a central role. I mean, if you look at the car industry, one of the reasons they are in dire straits is that they are just selling domestically 25% less cars, or 20 to 25% less cars than in 2019. And not just the Germans, but all cars. I mean, that is new car registrations. It's 25% down. And of course, you cannot expect that the domestic car industry is doing well if you have that kind of demand problem. And so plus there has been austerity now for 18 months, basically, in the wake of a major economic shock from the outside. And there's parallel to 20 years ago. We had there a number of years where also the German economy was not growing. There was continued austerity. Well, once that ended and we had a new Christian Democrat, Social Democrat coalition, the economy started to rebound and grew again. And many Americans don't know that, but from the year 2000 to 2019, we had roughly the same real per capita economic growth as the US. I think Sander is right that there's a chance that if you now give it a major fiscal boost, you might see some more impressive growth than what you think is possible.
Fran.
So I want to say that, first off, I agree with a lot of Alexander's points. But I think when it comes to the British agreement, I do think that there is room for a US-UK agreement. But any country in Europe thinking of hiving off to get its own agreement should look at the state of its royal family and look at whether it can do the kind of glitzy ceremony that the British royal family can do, because there's no doubt that this is one of the factors in the remarkably congenial meeting between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. On DSA and DMA, I think one of the great uncertainties or unpredictabilities about the US system right now is the role of certain tech companies and tech leaders. And it's clear that there are, in the executive order that came out, I think a week ago, that looked at DSTs, it's also going to look at things like DSA and DMA, and looks very much at any measure that could inhibit the growth of US tech companies as something that could potentially be subject to retribution through tariffs. And I think that is a real shift in the way the US is looking at addressing such policies, rather than just lobbying against them as they're being developed. But I think it also is something that we're going to see more of with this administration.
Thanks. With that, I just remains to thank all of you for your really incredibly insightful observations, to thank all of the viewers. Very difficult for me to sum this up in a few seconds, except to say that it sounds like geopolitics might come to the rescue of the German economic model if the next government lets it. So, but in any case, much to discuss in future meetings. Hope to have you all back. And until then, hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Bye-bye.